Yeah, and if attendees want to introduce themselves in the chat box, so we know who's here. Obviously, we won't be able to see each other, so that's good as well. I'm just going to mute you, Phil. So we got people coming from Manchester, from Derby, from Brighton, Bradford, Shepherd's Bush in London, Amherst, Massachusetts, so from the US, California, so from Israel, Palestine. Well, this is a truly global call. Emily from Ottawa. I just saw someone there, Okay, well, hopefully everybody's keeping an eye on the chat as it's coming up through there with people from all over. And I will make sure that we capture this chat because Team Greenwood from Walthamstow. Hello, Tim. I'm in Walthamstow. Solidarity from Birmingham, the home of the Lucas Plan. John Routley, one of the original Lucas Aerospace workers. So, welcome, John. Great that you're joining the call. And if we can bring you in, we will try to. And Ian Hewitt, who's been part of the Lucas Plan project as well. Recognizing we've had a large number of people sign up for this call, so I'm sorry for the delay. Just want to try and make sure that everybody has a chance to get in before we start, particularly with the speakers. So Naomi from Camden, I should say. So lots of people representing quite different areas. Hi from Sweden, the Right Livelihood Award, which Mike Cooley received in 1981. Wow, fantastic. Some people signed up in the last 5 minutes. All right, special wave to Phil and Hilary from John Routley. Last 30 seconds, right, okay. Well, I'm gonna stop after that. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. Just so we've got lots of time to get through, obviously, the speaker contributions and to do some Q&A as well at the end. So welcome everybody to this online event to discuss the new Lucas Plan for the post-COVID socially useful jobs, although obviously we're talking about post-COVID, but we're very much in the period and time of this pandemic. I'm Sam Mason from the new Lucas Plan project. I'm a trade unionist. I'm actually an officer with the PCS, Public and Commercial Services Trade Union, and a GMB member. And I'm pleased to be joined by 3 panelists here tonight, which is Phil Asquith, Hilary Wainwright, and Rebecca Keach, who's from Oshawa in Canada. So of course it's just early afternoon right now in Canada. So they'll each be given contribution of 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have hopefully some time for Q&A at the end, and we aim to finish by around 8:30. So just a few housekeeping points at the moment to start with. This is the first time we've run a webinar, so hopefully there won't be any glitches, but apologies if there are. And if I suddenly drop out my internet connection, I'll be facilitating for the night. Then we've got two co-hosts, Aisha and Michael, in the background who will pick things up, but hopefully we won't have those problems, but they'll also be helping to run the meeting tonight as well. We will be recording the event, including the Q&A, and we'll circulate that to attendees and put up on the website of the Lucas Plan afterwards, but obviously we'll notify you about that. Just a small note to make, obviously, although we're not gathering in a hall together, these meetings do still cost money, and we have very little money like most groups. So if anyone is able to spare a few pounds to help towards the cost of putting on the meeting, then there is a facility to donate via the Lucas Plan website, which is lucasplan.org.uk. Just to say very quickly before we get to the main body of the meeting about the new Lucas Plan project, for those who may not be familiar with us, we formed out of a 2016 conference which was set up to commemorate the 40 years anniversary of the Lucas Aerospace Alternative Plan, but not just as a commemorative event, but to see how we could actually take the ideas forward and the work that the former Lucas Aerospace workers did in using their own skills and knowledge for socially useful production, in how we address the threats of today of militarization, climate change and destruction of jobs by automation, and of course today very much in this situation of the pandemic. We had, coming out of that, 4 working groups which we set up around just transition, automation, arms conversion, defence diversification and local bottom-up planning, that was designed to take a holistic view of socially useful production of what is produced, and how that production processes are based on worker skills and the things that society needs. Obviously, in the current COVID pandemic, it's led to many thinking about the nature of work in society and how we value different skills across different types of work, and our collective responses to supporting our communities, such as mutual aid networks, which have particularly grown up in the UK, and I'm quite conscious that we have a lot of people from across the world on this call, which is fantastic. So if there's any jargon people don't understand or acronyms, then please put that in the chat, and hopefully others will respond to that. Obviously, one of the things we want to do, and I think I'd encourage you whilst listening to the contributions from our panelists tonight, is to think about how we take forward the energy from a meeting like this, and the discussion sort of afterwards, so it doesn't just end here, and think about how you might hold meetings in your region or have discussions, for example, within community groups. But I'll now hand over to our panelists, and our first panelist tonight is Phil Asquith, who's a former research engineer at Lucas Aerospace and member of the Shop Stewards Combine Committee. So over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. As Sam said, my name's Phil Asquith, and I'm a former active Combine member. Just to say that online tonight are 2 other former Combine members who were active on the plan, John Routley and Brian Salisbury. So I've been closely involved in the Lucas Plan since its conception in 1975. When we launched the plan in 1976, I have to say none of us ever dreamt that we would be speaking about it at conferences over 40 years later, and certainly not webinars. What, 1975? I'm sure the main reason that the plan has retained its currency, though, is that the problems which we were addressing in the 70s are essentially the same problems which confront us now, only writ larger and so much more urgent. We're here this evening, as Sam said, to discuss how we can learn from the COVID crisis to create workers and community plans for socially useful and ecologically useful production. And I'm going to address briefly how the Lucas Aerospace Combine tackled these types of issues in the 70s by compiling an alternative workers plan for conversion. Now we call it repurposing, it seems, from military to socially useful production. So the driver today for repurposing is the COVID crisis. In the 70s, the drivers for us included unemployment, the abuse of technology, the energy crisis, and proposed defence cuts, as 70% of Lucas Aerospace's business was mainly military. It's important to stress at this point that the Combined Shop Stewards Committee represented all of the staff and manual unions in all of the Lucas Aerospace plants, 100% membership almost, right up to senior levels of management. Without the Combine, there wouldn't have been a Lucas plan, and we believe that a robust workers' organisational structure is essential for ambitious campaigns such as these. As we worked on the plan, as workers in a high technology industry, we became more and more aware of the contradictions in our supposedly advanced society, contradictions to technology. We became more aware of technology with its exponential rate of growth, what it could provide and what the system allowed it to provide for society as a whole. For example, big contradiction, in our industry, our people made systems for Concorde, the world's most advanced aircraft then, but yet thousands of people were dying each year, mainly pensioners, for lack of cheap, simple heating systems, dying of hypothermia. In the International Year of the Disabled, I think it was in the late 70s, I just looked in my speech notes from then, we could see astronauts floating about in filtered TV pictures, effortlessly in space, whilst disabled people were making their way down the streets more or less as they did in medieval times. Also, 3,000 people at the time were dying each year from kidney failure because there weren't enough kidney machines to go round, but there were millions of unemployed people who could have been making them. And part of our fight at Lucas Aerospace was to stop the company cutting the production of the kidney machines we already made in the aerospace division at our factory of G&E Bradley's in London. So the whole market economy seemed incapable of matching society's needs with underused skills. In 1974, 2 years before the plan was launched, the Combine requested a meeting with Tony Benn, the Secretary of State for Industry, to discuss the defence cuts proposed by the new Labour government and the potential job losses following I nearly said Los Angeles, that's Lucas Aerospace. He said that the Combine should plan alternative industrial strategies and products, given the long lead time on military projects we had the time, and to use our members' skills in the planning process. So the message from the Secretary of State was quite clear. Don't sit and wait for it to happen. Do a preemptive strike. So after much discussion at the next Combine meeting, the way forward suddenly became clear. The Combine decided to draw up an alternative to the company's corporate plan independently. We took the view that if defence workers' skills were no longer required to make weapons, they should be used to benefit society. This was consistent with decades of Labour Party and trade union policy, but no one had ever bothered to plan the nuts and bolts of the conversion process. A plan to save jobs by making products to fulfil the unmet needs of society, products to be measured by their use value, not their exchange value. We talked of social profit from socially useful products. After all, the definition of profit on weapons contracts was purely political. Good example was the kidney machine at Lucas Aerospace, bought by the health service, taxpayers' money, military equipment bought by taxpayers' money, but one was profitable and one was unprofitable for the company. So a purely political definition of profit at work. We realised we were entering uncharted waters. There were no union manuals on how to do a workers' plan, and there were no precedents. Over a year, we consulted the workforce and some sympathetic experts and academics, and believe me, it was a long and strenuous process. We sent questionnaires around the sites, asking what people might make, what would be their skills, what would be their facilities. Some months later, there was a tremendous outpouring of creativity, which resulted in dozens of alternative products in 6 product groupings. I'm not saying these were all invented by our members. There were ones selected that would be appropriate for our manufacture. These product areas included renewables, energy conservation, medical technology, transport technology, and oceanics. And product examples which you can read, which were in the plan back then, believe it or not, were hybrid car engines, a road rail vehicle, electric cars, wind turbines, solar technology, fuel cells, heat pumps, microprocessors, which we now call chips, and higher performance kidney machines. If you delve into the plan, you can see this phrase called thermal pollution of the atmosphere. That's what we called climate change in those days. So the company said that was all futuristic, and they denigrated the plan by saying it was in the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade, which we thought was very funny. Looking back now, you can see all those products are everyday technology. This document here, which is the company's reply to the corporate plan, says about the need for wind turbines that they do not see the application for large wind turbine machines generally. So our members were right and they were wrong, and I don't apologise for saying that. So we got to a concrete set of alternatives for to arms production for the first time ever. It helped remove jobs from the disarmament debate, because you know, when there's a project cancellation, think of Trident, that the first thing people talk about is jobs, not whether the product's needed on grounds of national security. So it made a major international contribution to the peace movement, which embraced the plan enthusiastically. But the plan wasn't just about products. The plan also challenged the way in which products are produced, where skill and creativity are designed out of the production process. We proposed a reversal of this to human-centered production systems. It was axiomatic that we were challenging the misuse and abuse of science and technology as then practiced. These are not given. Their use is directed and for too long away from the socially useful economy. The plan also challenged design for built-in obsolescence. Products designed to wear out prematurely, fueling a throwaway economy with all of the wastage of the planet's resources that engenders. It was clear even then that a world economy based on endless growth could not be sustained by the Earth. What was the international reaction to the plan? It was overwhelming and completely supportive. We've sent combine representatives to hundreds of meetings and conferences in the UK, Europe, America, not Canada, I don't think, and Australia. What was the press reaction? Well, would you believe the Financial Times said this? The plan is one of the most advanced yet prepared in the UK by a group of shop stewards, one of the most radical alternative plans ever drawn up by workers for their company. Another quotation, and you'll be surprised where this comes from. It says, the document is clearly worth consideration by management, the Combines document, for it demonstrates clearly that if the workers don't carry out their jobs to the satisfaction of workers, then those same workers have the capability and know how to do it for them. Left-wing publication? No, Industrial Management in July 1976, which I believe went down like a lead balloon in the boardroom of Lucas Aerospace. But against this tidal wave of enthusiasm and support, there was one notable Canute-like exception, which was our side, the responsible national trade union officials and Labour government. Fearful of the wave of grassroots trade union activism at the time, they, the government and the national officials, formed an unholy alliance with Lucas directors, and the plan was ultimately rejected by the Labour government, despite a unanimous Labour Party conference resolution a year earlier to support the Lucas workers. And the government gave Lucas taxpayers' money to destroy even more jobs. People have said the plan failed. Succeed or fail, you can make your mind up. Well, first of all, our side, the Labour government and the unions certainly failed us, that's for sure. But the plan's made an enduring contribution to the debates that we're interested in, and the fact that I'm sitting here 40 years older, I think is testimony to that. The workers who produced the bottom-up strategy were proven right. Management, Labour government, and many of the trade union establishment were wrong. And again, I make no apology for saying that. The products that they rejected, like the products I've mentioned, are all commonplace now and largely manufactured overseas. It's the familiar story of British industry. Had the plan been accepted, we could have been manufacturing our own design of hybrid engines, wind turbines, and so on, and maybe enjoyed a couple of extra decades of lower CO2 emissions. But my penultimate point, actually, is this. Despite repeated threats by the company, there were no compulsory redundancies in Lucas Aerospace over the years of the plan, which, after all, was the original objective of the plan to protect jobs. Then there was not the political will. Now there is much more political will owing to the COVID crisis. I noticed on the log-on someone from the Right Livelihood Society is in the audience, and on our behalf, Mike coolly accepted the Right Livelihood Award in the late 90s, early 80s. And I can finish by no more eloquent a quote than Mike's last paragraph of his acceptance speech. Mike said, science and technology is not given. It's not like the sun or the moon or the stars. It was made by people like us, and if it's not doing for us what we want, we have a right and responsibility to change it. What we've got to remember is that the future is not out there someplace as America was out there before Columbus went to discover it. The future has yet got to be built by people like you and I, and we do have real choices. It can be a future in which we are not threatened with mass annihilation through nuclear weapons or ravaged with hunger. It could really be a world in which we treasure all our people equally and get science and technology to serve people rather than the other way round. In a sentence, we could begin to perform the modern miracle. We could help make the blind see, the lame walk, and we could feed the hungry. And I think that is the most elegant summary of why we are here together this evening. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Phil. And we do very much obviously appreciate you still being around to talk to us at these meetings 40 years later. So, and we'll keep abusing you of that as long as we can. Next, I'd like to hand over to Hilary Wainwright, who I'm sure is very familiar to most of you, but just says founding editor of Red Pepper magazine and co-author with Dave Elliott of the Lucas Plan, a new trade unionism in the making, and a fellow of the Transnational Institute. So over to you, Hilary.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm sorry not to be able to see your faces and communicate with you in the normal way. And I'm a bit unfamiliar with this sort of method, although I'm beginning to understand it. So my connection with Lucas was as a researcher, an academic based at the Open University with, well, it ended up with Dave Elliott. But it was an extraordinary sort of, well, honour and pleasure and sort of interesting experience, because basically the Lucas Combine Committee got public money, effectively research money, to appoint an academic to work with a university to look at one of the big problems they faced, which, as Phil said, was the negative response of the official trade union movement. And they appointed me, and I then spent 2 years, first in a way, really trying to understand them and the Combine Committee. So I would attend Combine meetings, and then I would address, interview trade union officials and try and address this structural problem about the trade union movement. And so for me, I learned a huge amount. So for me, it was a crucial sort of formative political experience, which is why I'm still involved, because it was just the inspiration of my life. Anyway, so that's just to introduce myself. And the book that we did is still useful. The Spokesman publishers have republished it. And it's got a whole chapter with, of just the plan itself. And then a lot of very detailed, I did interviews with all the shop stewards and taped them. So they're long quotes from some of the most amazing shop stewards that did this. I remember Danny Conroy, Ernie Scarborough, many others who Phil and John and Brian will remember with smiles and with admiration. And they're no longer with us, sadly, but they're with us in spirit and in terms of their influence. So just a beginning point, what I wanted to do really was, Phil, and then backed up by John and Brian, perhaps later in the discussion, can deal with all the details about the plan itself. I really wanted to talk about its relevance now, and its importance, and the importance of its message, and some of the, in a way, conditions, if you like, that make it possible, and address the problem of how can we take these ideas forward now? Because, it's not enough just to talk about them and celebrate them. We've got to think very practically. So that'll involve thinking a bit more about the unions and the importance of the Combine Committee and what that means for trade unionism today, and also about what political structures, the whole issue of public ownership, what kind of public ownership is necessary for this kind of plan to be implemented. You know, because clearly a purely profit-driven economy isn't going to implement this kind of plan. Just to sort of talk about the moment we're in briefly, to set the context. I mean, it seems obvious to all of us that we're in this context which is fraught with danger. So particularly this moment, so we face a context of huge danger. You know, the danger of a repeat, you know, rise of the infection, with all the deaths and all the tragedy that involves, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, an opportunity which is latent. You know, it's not being broadcast, obviously, by our government, but it's there, even in their language. And it's basically, we're faced with this dilemma. It's talked about when people talk about the dilemma between health and the economy, but it's basically, underlying that is the tension, the conflict between an economy and a society driven by profit, and a society and an economy driven by social need, and the way that health versus the economy is a stark expression of that, because health is about really the right to live, and as well as the right to live a dignified and decent life, and that's now, you know, in direct conflict with the economy, you know, in the way that people are being driven back to work effectively, to get manufacturing and construction going, even though it's clear that the health and safety conditions are unacceptable. And it'll be interesting to see if the unions, the RMT, are already talking about actually refusing to go to work if it's not safe. And so in a way, we're beginning to see the unions acting as the champions of social need. And interestingly, the whole issue of health and safety, which was an important issue for the Lucas Combine, because in a way, the trade union movement, particularly since the 70s, has had a very strong tradition of fighting around health and safety. It's one of the key areas where trade unionism goes beyond immediate questions of wages, and a kind of direct negotiation with management, sort of within the terms of capitalism, and moves into the area of need, of workers' needs, of workers' health and safety, versus the drive to profit. And health and safety is now becoming the kind of key issue in the workplace. But so this is an opportunity where somehow we've got to grasp that latent possibility of an economy based on meeting social need, which is clearly, you know, the only way in which the economy can be sort of rebuilt. And that points to the importance of the transition to a low carbon economy, the importance of rebuilding the health service, in a way, the importance also of public health, which isn't just about the health service, but which is about building a society that is, you know, is actually in the interests of people thriving. You know, public health is about people being able to have decent housing, decent income, decent working hours, and so on, so that they can thrive and therefore be healthy. So public health is a very good, all-encompassing idea that expresses social need. Now, this is where the key message of the plan, as Phil's emphasized, is also about production for social need, about production for use value. And in a way, it's saying that effectively wealth creation isn't necessarily for profit. That's a political choice, and a choice that can be reversed. And this is what we're, in a way, needing to talk about today. In a way, it's a context where the trade unions and the workers are actually arguing for production for the common good. So, you know, instead of a trade unionism that's just within the confines of getting the best deal out of a relationship with private employers, it's about trade unions acting for a wider common interest. And in a way, that's what the RMT and other unions are doing now when they are defending their workers' health and safety at work, because it's not just about their workers, it's about the community, the whole society, because workers are citizens and workers are in families and they go back to neighborhoods and could infect the rest of the community. So we're in a very, very important moment for this whole idea of production for social need. So when we talk about how can this be done, we need to talk about agency. Who are the agents of change? And here, you know, we should look at the implication of Mike's, that last quote, because it's in a way pointing back to this idea that, you know, the future isn't out there, the future depends on us, is also in a way saying the future, it depends on us deciding not to reproduce the status quo. Clearly, the existing economy depends on us carrying on, you know, as you can see now, you know, clearly the economy depends on us all being complicit with the idea of we've got to get back to work as normal, back to the normal daily life, because that daily life isn't just about our livelihoods, it's actually about keeping the existing system going. And so we need to find a way in which we can survive and fight for our livelihoods, but also fight for a different form of production. And although it's, you know, very hopeful that there are all these, as Phil referred to, all these networks of mutual aid, of support. I mean, here in Hackney where I live, you know, there's masses of different mutual aid groups that I can see from my WhatsApp are doing incredible things, meeting people's needs around food, around childcare, and so on. And those in a way prefigure a different kind of society. They do prefigure a society based on meeting need, but they don't have real power. I mean, they have a moral power, but it's not enough. And that's where the trade unions are so crucial. And that's where the point about the Lucas Plan steward, the Combine Committee, is that they saw themselves not just as workers, but also as members of communities. So many of the ideas, when you look at them, they're inspired by, you know, their relationships to the community, their knowledge of disabled people and their needs, the knowledge of people in the third world and their needs, sort of, and the whole thinking about the environment, or the thinking about war. I mean, Phil was a member of CND, or probably still is, but you know, that the whole issue of nuclear disarmament and swords into plowshares, as it were, was already a debate from which the Lucas Plan drew, and the Lucas workers were influenced. So they were thinking wider, and I think crucial there is the relationship with the Labour Party, that historically often trade unions have handed over anything political wider than the workplace to the Labour Party and sort of parked it there and seen their job as just dealing with trade unionism, the workplace. And I think we've seen a change in that, both because workers, you know, haven't been able to trust the Labour Party, you know, under Tony Blair to, for example, fight privatisation. So many trade unions themselves have taken on that defence of the public good. And then we've seen in the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn a kind of leadership that's pushed, you know, the responsibility back on the unions. John McDonnell saying about public ownership, that we won't go towards the old public ownership. We're thinking about a new kind of public ownership where actually the worker's knowledge is what's key. And he quotes Mike Cooley, that tacit practical knowledge that is really the basis on which we can develop alternatives. So that we need a trade unionism that can use that kind of vision. And so the detail of the Lucas Plan is very important to work for, including its context. I mean, Phil mentioned Tony Benn, and that was a discussion that led to a discussion in the Combine about nationalisation. So a lot of people had not a very good experience of the nationalisation of the mines, which or of the railways, which ended up in a lot of redundancies and basically public companies run like private companies. And so in a way, they were saying, we want nationalisation, we want public ownership, but on our terms. And so I think now, post-COVID, there'll be a lot of discussion about public ownership and restoring the public NHS, making it public again. but I think there'll be an opportunity there to say on whose terms, and how do we kind of embed it? How do we make it truly public in its day-to-day running, which is where the role of the workers and the unions will come in. So I'll stop there, but I think also I'm being told to stop, but I will stop. And so hopefully the discussion can take some of those ideas further. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Hilary, and threw up a lot of issues there, and really important things, particularly the engagement with trade unions and issues around industrial democracy. Now I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca Keach, and I'm really actually honoured to have Rebecca on this call and join us from Canada today, because I've been really inspired reading about what Rebecca and her comrades in Oshawa are doing and through their initiative there. So Rebecca is a laid-off GM auto worker and an activist in the Green Jobs Oshawa project. So over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me in and letting us talk about Green Jobs Oshawa. I'm going to start my talk with telling a little bit about who GM is and how Green Jobs Oshawa came about. So General Motors has been producing vehicles at their facility in Oshawa for just over 100 years. It has an area of approximately 10 million square feet and has produced in excess of 20 million vehicles. It was one of the most decorated, productive, and efficient plants in North America. On November 26, 2018, GM announced that the Oshawa facility, along with 4 other North American plants, would be unallocated. On December 18, 2019, the last truck rolled off the line and thousands in Oshawa and the surrounding community were left unemployed. With the introduction of the North American Free Trade Agreement and subsequent expansion of global free trade agreements, auto manufacturing in Canada has been hard hit. GM, which employed 23,000 hourly and salaried workers at its height, had less than 2,500 employees when it announced the closure. General Motors' withdrawal from Oshawa has been painful, particularly in light of the brutal attack on workers' wages and working conditions, as the corporation demanded concessions for continuing product and employment. In 2009, GM received almost $11 billion in government assistance to keep the company afloat. The company and the Canadian government demanded major concessions from workers to secure the bailout money. While GM rapidly returned to profitability and made billions of dollars in profits, workers did not regain any of their losses and in fact continued losing ground. 2-tiered wages with a 10-year grow-in, virtually no wage increases in over a decade, the elimination of the defined benefit pension for new workers, the loss of inflation protection for retirees' pensions, the massively expanded use of temporary workers, and the outsourcing of jobs, to name a few. It was a complete victory for the corporation, and still they chose to abandon Oshawa. It is a cruel lesson in the absolute evil of multinational capitalist corporations. When GM announced the closure of the Oshawa facility, there was anger and outrage from the community and across Canada, but almost no political response. The provincial premier, Doug Ford, basically shrugged his shoulders and said, "The ship has left the dock." Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, promised support for workers, but took no action to keep the plant open. Unifor, the union representing the workers at the GM plant and many of the supplier plants, expressed outrage and vowed to keep the plant open. The union launched an expensive media campaign, including TV and newspaper ads, that attempted to shame GM for leaving Canada after taking a taxpayer bailout, and also called for a boycott of Mexican-made GM vehicles. There were lawn signs, t-shirts, and banner actions. But notable was the absence of any meaningful stoppage to the production of vehicles in the Oshawa plant. The outcome of this? GM agreed to do limited aftermarket part production, work that will see up to only 300 people recalled and the massive complex remain mostly idled. This does not sound sustainable. Of course, even with militant worker action, it is questionable whether GM could have been induced to stay. However, there was another campaign born at the same time, because there is another way. Green Jobs Oshawa is a coalition of workers, environmentalists, academics, and community members. We recognized in the midst of a climate crisis requiring immediate action in a community facing massive job loss and disruption, the need for a bold idea, one that I think many of you are already familiar with. Bring the plant under democratic control through government ownership and build battery electric vehicles or other products that meet social need instead of corporate greed. To bring this vision to life, we commissioned a preliminary feasibility study, launched a website, did media interviews, created a Facebook page, spoke at events, and raised awareness that another way is possible. Our message was covered by mainstream television and daily newspapers. We were asked to speak at a global climate strike in Toronto and have participated in events on public ownership and just transitions. The preliminary feasibility study, which can be found at greenjobsoshawa.ca, was based on a triple bottom line. It was based on social, environmental, and economic benefits. The study showed that a publicly owned assembly operation in Oshawa could create up to 13,000 jobs, build 150,000 battery electric vehicles in 5 years, reduce CO2 emissions by 400,000 tons, and break even in year 4 while making an actual profit by year 5. This message resonated with many, particularly environmentalists and many in the labor movement. It was a concrete example of a project that could be used as the engine of a workers' Green New Deal. The foundation of this vision is that there is an approaching crisis which requires decisive and bold action on a scale that must be mandated by government. Individuals cannot do this alone. We must recognize that decisions based on corporate profits are not in the best interest of workers, communities, or society. We believe that manufacturing capacity must be protected so that we are able to respond quickly and effectively to any challenges. We believe that not only must we recognize essential workers, but that there is also essential manufacturing that is necessary for the sustainability of our future. However, that manufacturing should not be done for profit, which is why we are promoting a publicly owned crown corporation that could use principles of democratic planning and production based on societal need. We shouldn't accept corporations trying to make a greedy dollar off the backs of all of us in a time of need. And then the COVID-19 crisis came, and unsurprisingly, the foundations of our call for government intervention at the GM Oshawa facility became even more relevant and urgent, as Canadians quickly became aware of how unprepared we were for this pandemic. Lives have been put at risk and lost due to inadequate personal protective equipment. Today, more than 3,200 Ontario healthcare workers are infected with COVID-19. Those on the healthcare front lines now account for nearly 16% of the province's COVID cases. This is an infection rate 4 times that of China. The devastation in our long-term care homes is heartbreaking. And this crisis is being played out globally. Our governments are not protecting the vulnerable. So Green Jobs Oshawa has raised our voice to call on the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario to immediately order the production of essential medical equipment and supplies at the mostly vacant Oshawa GM complex. This should be the first step towards establishing a publicly owned manufacturing center that could supply strategically necessary goods in time of crisis. To accomplish this, we have lobbied politicians and unions for support, held a virtual press conference, launched a new letter writing campaign, and participated in a webinar hosted by the Council of Canadians. Auto and parts manufacturers are uniquely suited to assist and convert in this crisis. They excel at logistics, supply chains, and ramping up production. However, conversion should not be left up to the goodwill of corporations. We need the government to intervene in a methodical and planned manner. Order conversion and ensure the resources needed are directed to these endeavors. In order to accomplish this quickly and to the required scale, it must be mandated. There are examples of auto and part suppliers pivoting production in a matter of days and weeks across the world, including plants in Warren, Michigan and Kokomo, Indiana, where GM quickly started production of ventilators and masks when faced with the threat of government orders. And we are excited to share that on April 24th, it was announced that GM would be producing masks at its Oshawa plant. But it is not enough. The excitement of the announcement quickly disappeared with the release of the details. Despite the production of N95 masks at GM's Michigan plant, only surgical masks would be produced in Oshawa. Despite millions of square feet of manufacturing space, only 30,000 square feet will be used. And despite having hundreds of workers awaiting recall to GM and thousands more in the community unemployed, only 50 to 60 workers are being recalled. In light of the desperate need, this is not enough, and Green Jobs Oshawa has continued to call for more. We organized an auto cavalcade of over 65 vehicles, and we have continued to publicly highlight the need for immediate life-saving conversion and are planning another media event. We don't need hospital workers, long-term care workers, transit drivers, grocery and food suppliers, and every other person that has now been recognized as essential to be heroes, risking their life every day at work to help others. We need them to be able to confidently and safely go to work, knowing they have the proper personal protective equipment to keep them safe and their families safe. We need to be clear that the need for PPE and medical equipment will not end in a month or two. This is a worldwide pandemic that will continue in waves until a vaccine can be discovered, manufactured, and distributed. It is also clear that this is not the only crisis we will find ourselves in if we do not take immediate action on climate as well. Public ownership and conversion by themselves are not a cure-all solution, but public ownership and conversion provide an opportunity to serve the needs of the greater good in a manner that provides democratic control, long-term planning around need instead of profit, battles gross inequality, and tackles the climate crisis. The only way to take advantage of this is to organize. Organize workers, community members, technical experts, environmentalists, and every person that wants a better tomorrow. We know that healthcare and other vital services must be public, not run for private profit. Protecting manufacturing and transforming our economy to sustainable energy are just as important and cannot be left to corporate decision makers. The lack of preparation for this pandemic is a stark warning that a Green New Deal must be launched now. We must do better and we must think bigger. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really fantastic. And I mean, it is just so inspiring to hear what you've been doing in a very up-to-date situation in terms of both fighting for your jobs and actually looking and using those ideas as the former Lucas Aerospace workers did for socially useful production. And I think, you know, that really is the message, that there is another way. And equally, we're going to be seeing globally mass redundancies across the board and lots of workers with their skills laid off in industries that clearly need transition, such as in the energy sector. So this is a real immediate crisis as well that we need to respond to. So it's really good to see there's lots of questions, and actually quite long questions in the chat box, but I will pull a few of those out and just I'll put a couple to the panel, and you can choose which ones, or if you want to respond to them. And I think that perhaps the first one's quite apt in terms of talking about gigantic global corporations whose aim seems to be to extract as much profit as possible and stash it in offshore accounts, and a Labour Party that's now considerably less wing than it was in the 70s. Is this a barrier? And if so, how do we overcome it? So that's a question about how we can actually tackle the big multinational corporations. The other, I must admit, I'm not quite familiar with the term, that who will bail the cat? If the answer only grassroots groups taking control of corrupted organisations like trade union hierarchies, then you only push back the question a bit. How will it be different next time? How do we not reproduce the status quo? So what is it that we now as progressive need to start doing differently? So that's a question about how we change some of our structures, and I think some of the things that Hilary was touching on her contributions. And thank you, this is from John Routley, who's another former Lucas Aerospace shop steward. As a result of the current pandemic, we have seen very clear examples of engineering conversion and, to a certain degree, micro conversion activities taking place. From the production of ventilators to face masks, We have also seen economic conversion taking place across the globe on a scale that we almost can't comprehend. Can the panel suggest how we can organise to ensure we keep this momentum going before we go back to the neoliberal globalisation that is destroying our planet? So I think I'll leave it with those because they're all three quite big questions and they have some parallels and crossovers. So I'll invite anybody who perhaps wants to make a contribution on those. Phil, you look like you're...
Yeah. I think it's the first point about tackling the power of corporations. It seems to me that there's a lot that can be done at local level, but in terms of conversion or repurposing, I think it's going to take a major change in industrial policy to bring this about. There are some examples from the United States after the Vietnam War. There were many conversions, but they were mainly base conversions. And our friends in Canada will know much more about it than I do. In the 80s, we visited Minnesota a few times, and they brought in state legislation to help people in this kind of situation. In the 80s, drafted by a good friend of mine, there were various attempts to introduce conversion legislation into Congress, and it failed by reducing majority each time. There's a whole chapter and verse. I wrote an article in Red Pepper on it, but basically it would give workers in every plant, every defence plant, the right to set up a Lucas-style corporate planning committee, and it would be financed by a levy on defence contracts. Those are initial thoughts. Talking about major interventions, I was asked to speak at a conference in Brussels last year, and to be honest, I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be about till I got there. What they're doing is there's a 10-year programme of decarbonisation of the coal mining regions in the European Union. There are 3 major conferences a year on the issues, and whereas our coal mines were closed, crash bang wallop, you're out of a job the next day, what they're doing in Europe at the moment is they're financing a whole fully organised and funded programme of conversion to decarbonise the economy for obvious reasons to different types of more modern industries. That's going on under our noses. And I wasn't aware of it until I walked right into the middle of it, that I can't think of anything that's like that that's going on in our country. So those are just some initial thoughts from the higher end to the lower end. There's no one solution. I think it's got to be a number of solutions at different levels and scales of magnitude.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Does Hilly or Rebecca want to come in at all?
So, trying to link the questions a bit. I mean, I think this question of, I don't quite understand either the phrase bell the cat, but anyway, I can see what Mark Hudson's getting at when she's talking about, simply trying to take control of the unions. Isn't that just going to lead to new bureaucracy, endless cycle? And I think, no, I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at is the fact that the Lucas stewards, they created a different kind of trade unionism that, they did at that time begin to spread horizontally. I think we've got to think not in terms of taking over, like replacing the existing hierarchies, but creating a different kind of power. I mean, in a way, the hierarchical notion of the trade unions was sort of assuming that power really lay with Parliament and the government, and that the point of the trade union movement was to fight for wages and better wages and conditions. But when it came to political change, leave it to a Labour government and use the Labour movement to get it elected. But the Combine Committee, in a way, was saying that actually power and knowledge lay with the workers themselves, working with communities and so on. And so they developed, with the help of a very interesting organisation called the Institute for Workers' Control, they developed a kind of network of shop stewards combine committees. That's how I first met Mike Cooley at a meeting of the Institute of Workers' Control. because that would bring together shop stewards from Lucas, from Vickers, the engineering company Vickers, from British Leyland, where they also developed an alternative plan. And so, in a way, it's about developing a kind of horizontal kind of power that is coordinating the power and knowledge that exists in the workplace, and where there's a greater openness to a wider vision of the kind that Rebecca was talking about. And that was, again, some support. I mean, there's some trade union leaders that were supportive, like Ron Todd of the TNG, and I think to a degree Hugh Scanlon from the AUW. But I think the way we've got to kind of learn from that is looking at what power we have in our own workplaces or our own communities. I mean, I think Rebecca's model is just exemplary of, organizing in the community, but linking with the unions and building up a kind of an alternative source of power that also needs, it depends also on exposing the existing system. So it needs a kind of moral power, which I think on the first question of, tax havens and so on, I think the basis of that is there. I think one of the consequences of the Corbyn campaign and movement is a complete sort of demystification of what's happening with tax. The whole fact of tax havens and the wealth of the 1% and the way they're getting away with not paying any tax, Amazon and so on, is now common knowledge. And I think there's a greater confidence amongst working people to take action against what is clearly an immoral system. So I think now turning that kind of sense of injustice in our system into the basis for a campaign around climate justice, which has been in a way galvanized by the actions of young students and school students and Greta Thunberg, that now has got a huge moral power, which we've got to turn into powerful action, material organization. And so I think we've got to, the Oshawa example is really good. And Rebecca, I'd love to publish your speech in Red Pepper if I can get back in touch, because it's really inspiring. And the more we can spread those examples, because that was the point. The Lucas plan, that inspired other people. It inspired workers in Chrysler, in British Leyland. When people already feel the system is wrong, but they feel powerless. So when they see groups of workers taking action with an alternative vision, they think, yeah, okay, we could do that. And actually, just finally, I did a bit of research, which I was going to feed into this, about workers who have taken up the call of the government for the production of ventilators. And in Airbus in North Wales, a whole production centre is being created for the production of ventilator components. And what's crucial, I mean, there's a lot of talk about all these companies, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, etc., but nobody in the mainstream talks about the role of the unions. And I was just going to quote the worker there, the convener there, and he basically the organisation of the union was crucial to this process. If the union, he said, without the union, to be honest, it would have been chaos. Lots of problems without any procedure to resolve them. We've built up a tried and tested organisation and established procedures for solving them. And in particular, he's thinking about the health and safety side of it, because the ventilators have to be produced in a very, sterile environment where health and safety is key. And because that's key to the workers and they understand the social side of things, they've been crucial in achieving those kind of conditions. So that's not probably a full answer to Mark or any of the questions, but just a sense of direction.
I need to unmute. Thanks, Hilary. Rebecca, I'll let you come in, but there was one specific question to you as well, so I thought I'd just add that, so perhaps you can address it in your response. Are there similar means of state intervention, such as the Defence Production Act in the US, that can be invoked in Canada?
Yes, there is, but currently it isn't being used for manufacturing. I think it's called the Emergency Measures Act in Ontario, and it's been used to suspend collective agreements in hospitals, but it hasn't been used to mandate production that I'm aware of. I think but there is definitely legislation available. I just don't think that it's being used right now. To talk about the idea of grassroots taking control of unions, I think is it's just the wrong direction to take the conversation. What we need to really talk about is how do we transform the labor movement as a whole and not just the unions, because labor is so much more than what happens just in our workplace. And building coalitions and working with the community and really pulling different people in gives you a momentum and a power that you can't find just within your workplace. The idea of taking over, I think, we really need to re-examine what's failing in the labor movement to take us to where we are now, because we didn't get to this point with governments and corporations and all else that's going wrong right now just overnight. It's been a process, and we need to look back over in our history and see what we've been doing wrong and what we need to do to plan to do differently. The most important thing, I think, is to reinstill hope in people, to give people hope and to create a plan and have them participate in it. We can't, I think the model of just doing things for people, a service model in unionism or a service model of government, has failed us miserably, and we need to re-examine what it means to be democratic and participatory. And without doing any of these things, we are going to have a very difficult time meeting the challenge ahead of us. One of the other things I think that is most important is talking to people. Just keep having conversations with people. But it's not always about telling them what you think. A lot of times it's about listening to what they're saying and understand what they're afraid of and what their concern is, and trying to help them have hope again. Those are critical things that need to happen, but most of all is engaging with workers and community members.
Whoops. Thanks. Sorry, I just clicked out on my screen and it went a bit strange. Sorry, my screen went a bit strange then. I just lost the questions. Yeah, so there's a lot of comments. I mean, people saying obviously that they agree with everything said, and we can't rely on business or government to implement plans. And I think you've all kind of touched on some of the organisation we need to do. There was one direct question to you, Phil, about parallels with the Madrigon co-ops in Spain. So I don't know how much you know about those, perhaps to answer. And yeah, perhaps if you just want to talk about that, and then I'll address some of the other questions.
Yeah, the direct answer is, whilst I know about Mondragon, I know very little about it, so I couldn't actually draw any parallels with those at all. So that's not particularly helpful. That type of structure, looking at the cooperative structure, didn't really fly very far with us in Lucas Aerospace, because it wasn't seen as an appropriate solution for the situation we were in. So sorry, I can't really add any more than that, because I don't have enough knowledge of Mondragon.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, there's a question here from Dave King. Dave's actually also part of the New Lucas Plan project, and I think an important one, and it relates, and I can't remember if it came up in the questions or the chat. I think somebody had mentioned something about reduce working hours and basic income. And so that there's links here. But so there's been lots of suggestions that after the pandemic, we will see an acceleration in automation. What's the relationship between the issues of socially useful production and the threat of automation? I don't know if anybody wants to pick that up.
Yeah, I think automation isn't going to go away, and it's been fairly consistent. Technological advances have been increasing exponentially, and that's not going to go away. So what we need to have a conversation around isn't how to stop it or how to prevent job loss because of it, but how do we change our society so that the advances benefit everybody. It's having a conversation about the common good. I absolutely think that we're going to see massive advances in technology, and I think we're seeing an expanded use of it already during the pandemic, and I think that's just going to continue. I think we should embrace it and figure out how to make it work for all of us.
Can I say something? Sorry, can I just add to that? I agree with Rebecca, and I think that implicit in, well, explicit too in the Lucas plan, I mean, Phil can correct me or develop this, you know, was the idea that we actually don't take technology and it's the idea of technological progress as a sort of given. We don't accept this idea that there is simply one way, you know, that technology it goes in one way. There's a kind of linear development. You know, the point about the Lucas plan was not only about products, but it was also about technology, about the actual processes of work and the technologies of work and work organization. And they made the point, particularly Mike and Phil and those involved in the design of products, that actually, you know, technology is imbued with values and choices, that, you know, that every technological development can be applied in different ways, but also its actual development can be in different directions. I mean, you know, we can see it now. I mean, I'm not a particular expert in the new technology, but I can see even in, you know, my own uses of it. You know, when I first got involved in the first had a connection to the web, I used a connection through an organization called PopTel that had been the product of actually trade unionists trying to connect with each other internationally. And they developed this server, in effect, which was a democratically organized server that was used to service trade union links. And now they're the phone co-op, which is a cooperative providing a server that is very democratic and transparent. And yet, you know, we've also seen that the ICT has enabled Amazon, Facebook, you know, all the different sort of IT corporations that are incredibly opaque about their methodologies and their platforms and their codes and their working systems. And we can see also, you know, the whole technology behind Uber is a technology that could be used in a completely different way to create a kind of commons for different purposes, including cars. You could have a non-profit kind of use of that. And so it's the idea that technology's direction depends on us, and we can rethink it. Like, I mean, one of the products in Lucas' plan was this idea of telesuric devices. So, you know, you need for, like, say, dealing with problems in oil rigs, you know, beneath the sea, you can't always go down and sort of look at barnacles and things. So the idea of a remote control of a device that, you know, can actually be remotely addressing the problems down at the bottom of the sea, you know, that could use the new technology to enable somebody to operate that mechanism indirectly. And so, you know, in a way, the Lucas plan is full of ideas about a different direction for technology. So now we need the kind of people who are in IT to be to be thinking, as it were, politically and ethically about the technologies that they're developing, you know, and thinking about alternatives. So the more we can have the kind of alliances that Rebecca's talking about between community, between people with the needs, as it were, and the workers with the technical knowledge, but technical knowledge which isn't technical in the sense of neutral. But Phil can come in a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, central to all this, and it started, I think we felt the effects of it in the 60s particularly, although I'm not actually quite that old, was the whole thing about Taylorism, which was Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management. And that was all about the lovely but horrible quotes from him about his approach to the design process. And it was all about breaking down work into the smallest fragments. So the more that work was de-skilled, the more of the skill that they extracted from you and stored in the machines, the less power the workers and the trade unions had. Those of you that are almost as old as me might remember Harold Wilson in the 60s, his speech about the white heat of the technological revolution, where that would create a problem where technology was doing everything for everyone, and society's biggest problem would be how to fill the leisure time. And what actually happened was that the technology increased the working tempo for most people, made other people consequently unemployed. And so the phrase that we used to use was that the white heat of technology was simply burning up people's jobs. So there is quite a lot in the plan. That's what the whole human-centered system is about, designing systems so that the operator retains the skill and the creativity. But that's a complete variance with what's been happening over the last 20 to 30 years. And Hilary just put a finger on it there. What we need now are people in IT who can actually develop this concept further for us. Other examples in the plan about sort of the human-centered nature of technology. I never understood what the word telesuric meant when I first heard it, and I don't think many people do, but I looked it up once, and it's Greek for hands at a distance. So, for example, if you take Hilary's example, you're sending the technology into the hazardous environment. The operator is in a safe environment, but the operator's skill is still in charge of operating. They use it now in operations, delicate operations. One application would have been coal mining, for example, where you sent the machines in and the miners operated it with all their skills on the surface. So that's the whole area, and it's in need of development, but it does actually run counter to the principles of Taylorism, which we've been trying to fight off for years, generally unsuccessfully.
Thanks, Phil. Hilary, we've got about 10 minutes or so left, so I was just going to link up a couple of, try and link up some of the questions here. There's a lot about, obviously, this notion, which I think we're sort of seeing internationally, about things won't go back to normal. We need to change. We need to use the COVID crisis to change. So there's been a question about how can we put diversification or repurposing at the heart of Build Back Better campaign and the Green New Deal. I don't know, I think Build Back Better is actually quite a global notion. I know it's a campaign that's just launched here in the UK through Green New Deal UK, but I think this is a term that is being used kind of more internationally, and I think that links quite nicely with a question I hope doesn't mind if I mention Tony Lee. He's also involved with Green Jobs Oshawa, and he says that Rebecca mentioned that her union Unifor called for a boycott of Mexican-made vehicles, which seems to harm international solidarity. What is the way to organise that unites workers in different countries? And I think it's important to kind of perhaps end on this note of international solidarity, because that was obviously very key, and what the Lucas plan actually took that out to different countries as well. And whatever we try and do here in the UK is obviously very important, that we're supporting and working with brothers and sisters globally across the labour movement and developing these ideas, and we're not doing this in isolation. So I think perhaps if each of you could sort of respond to those questions and comments, and perhaps with any closing remarks that you'd like to make. Thank you.
I guess I can take a shot. So I think, you know, building solidarity across borders is crucial to changing how we do things and how we see things. I found Unifor's call to boycott Mexican-made vehicles very problematic on a number of fronts. And one is which seems to be a global issue of a rise in hatred and prejudice and racism and blaming other people for our problems. And we cannot scapegoat others, and we can't buy into the idea of being in competition with other people. We have a wealthy enough world that if we redistribute it properly, then none of us need to be going without and in need. And you know, it seems almost logical. Well, if they're taking our jobs to Mexico, then we need to stop supporting Mexico production, and then they'll know that they have to build cars in Canada. And that's just not the way that it goes. Boycotts are, I mean, they're very difficult to be effective on a global scale for any length of time. And to call for a partial boycott of a company doesn't seem to have much long-term value, and it risked pitting workers against each other. And I can give you one example. I know as a Canadian worker, I didn't like it when I saw a Facebook post from an American asking why there was a Canadian produced vehicle in their showroom when they were having 4 plants shuttered at the same time. It didn't feel very good, and I certainly wouldn't want to be making other people feel that way, because it's not my fault. I'm just trying to feed myself and my family. And the Green Jobs Oshawa was really inspired by global events. The Lucas Plan certainly inspired us in our formation. There was a rally held in Detroit by the Democratic Socialists of America and grassroots GM workers there calling for the plant to be taken over. And those are the types of things that if we look around the world and we look for the good things that are happening and we draw on best practices, we can make great things happen in our home areas. Sorry for the cat.
That's great. We love the cat. And Hilary or Phil, do you?
Well, I mean, I just agree. I mean, I think that international solidarity is crucial, and I think that, you know, we've got a lot of problems in how to build it. I mean, but now, in a way, this global crisis is a kind of, it is like a rehearsal, or at least we should treat it as a not exactly rehearsal, but a kind of experience that will enable us to be way more, you know, almost intimately international in the face of the climate crisis. And so we've got the problem of how to achieve this in a context where, you know, the labour movement and social movements have been quite weak. I mean, because I go back to the 70s, I can remember a time, maybe Phil can too, where there were international combine committees where Dunlop, for example, a rubber, you know, tire making company, Dunlop Pirelli, they had a combine like the Lucas combine, but on an international scale that could organize international action. Similarly in Ford's, but I mean, you know, since neoliberal sort of attacks on the unions, that kind of strength isn't there. So we have to use new kinds of ways of organizing, and obviously in many countries there are, you know, like the organization around zero contracts and the treatment of McDonald's treatment of workers. that's become a pretty international campaign. And sometimes those international campaigns around, you know, the in a way the super exploitation of precarious workers, they can use another power. If they haven't got much shop floor bargaining power, but they have the power of the brand, you know. So McDonald's clearly is super sensitive to its image, and when a group of people, maybe about 5-10 years ago, maybe more, they started leafleting, exposing McDonald's treatment of workers, of the environment, and so on. And McDonald's, you know, they just had like a sort of duplicated leaflet, and McDonald's spent millions bringing them to trial, you know, and trying to suppress that criticism. So we can organize not only as workers, but in solidarity with workers, as users and consumers, and also people, you know, that can use social media to expose and shame these companies, and use in a way their vulnerability on the question of the brand. So we've got to think of new sort of leverage that we have, but we have to do this in an international context. So it's both the examples that can spread, you know, virally now through the social media and through peer-to-peer, all the kind of peer-to-peer possibilities that exist on an international scale. But it's also thinking about what sources of power open up that can address the vulnerability and contradictions that these companies face, that depend so much on consumers and on having a good image, which we can immediately challenge when we see what they're actually doing.
Thank you, Hilary. Phil, I'll hand over to you, and perhaps quite aptly to say final comments and to wrap up this session.
Okay, thank you. Just briefly, I've got my eye on the time. We also had international links through Lucas Aerospace, although Lucas Aerospace wasn't the same multinational as, for example, GM, although Lucas Industries was to an extent. But it's quite interesting. In Birmingham, they used to tell us that we weren't as productive as the Lucas Aerospace plant in Birmingham. And then generally they told the British workers that the Germans were much more efficient than we were. And then when we actually went over and spoke to trade unionists in Germany, whether it was on the plan or whether it was something else, they used to say, oh, that's interesting. What we're being told as German workers is we're lazy and we don't work as hard as the Japanese. And so that was actually invaluable, that liaison. Now, the formal liaison internationally did exist, and I'm sure it still does now. But the issue was who went to them. They never used to allow grassroots people to go through the international structures to liaise. It was always the full-timers who we thought were quite remote from our problems. So I'm quite well known for my lack of predisposition to sort of certain individuals at the national level, you know, from those days. The other slightly related point is that if, for example, we started producing socially useful products at Lucas Aerospace, there's the issue of that the people used to raise displacement. Because we started to produce X, Y, or Z, would that lose jobs of other workers who were already producing them? And generally speaking, I thought that if we were producing for unmet social need, then there wasn't an issue of displacement because the goods weren't there in the first place. But just kind of trying to start to round up, this is now the third time in a fortnight I've had the experience of these webinars. And the answer, part of the answer, I think, is staring us in the face, quite literally. As people were logging on, I was just astonished where people were. The messages coming up for me on the screen who I met from years ago, as we saw, the people from Israel, from California, and so on. And this medium, I think, for discussion and for spreading the word and for generating solidarity is absolutely first class. And I think we're only just at the start of learning how to use this properly.
Thanks, Phil. Yes, you're quite right, because I'm forgetting to unmute myself, which I think we've probably all been experiencing in meetings. That's go on. Yeah, go on, Hilary.
That while I completely agree with Phil and Rebecca on the importance of this international, I think, and there's no time to discuss it, but we shouldn't lose the importance of the local at the same time. I mean, in a way, Rebecca's talked about the local in terms of coalitions, and I think we must talk about the local in terms of coalitions between, you know, extra parliamentary sort of civil society, radical civil society, and political local councils who've been, in a way, victims of neoliberalism and austerity and so on, and who are now, in particularly, again, it's an opportunity in this crisis. Many of them are kind of being forced to kind of respond to the needs of their communities, and they're under pressure from a lot of activists in the community, including people who in the Labour Party came to the Labour Party from the community movement. And so all I'd say is just keep this local in mind. And actually, you know, one of the participants, Mike Hales, reminds us that Mike Cooley and I, but Mike Cooley was important. We went to work for the Greater London Council after the defeat politically of the Lucas Plan, and actually he was able there to put into practice, you know, to a limited degree, because in the end we were abolished by Mrs. Thatcher, but put into practice some of the ideas in the plan at that local level. So it's the local and the international that we've got to think innovatively about.
Thanks, Hilary. So go on, Rebecca, go on.
I just wanted to make one final comment, and that is around organizing for change. And it's not to wait until the pandemic is over. We have a very unique opportunity where there is a lot of upheaval, and there will be people with a lot of money trying to make a lot more money. And we need to be pushing back and fighting back and changing people's minds now, not waiting till later. The time is now to organize.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that's a nice segue actually between all those final comments and just some sort of closing remarks. Firstly, thank you to Phil, Rebecca and Hilary. Fantastic contributions, and it's a shame we can't go on discussing more, but I know these Zoom meetings get quite tiring for everybody, and I really appreciate you giving up your time. I really hope we can continue, obviously, discussion with Green Jobs Oshawa and all the various initiatives that are going on, and see it's the start of making those links and organising. And obviously, organising is very key. I'm really sorry to the attendees who've raised questions and didn't address them. Lots of there about collaborating with other organisations such as Iron and Earth in Canada, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is a global initiative which I'm part of, and how we build links within those, and also building our own power. But I think it's that key about now what do we do locally? We've participated in a meeting like this, so how do we take that back into our own communities or workplaces or spaces where we can start organising, and immediately, because I entirely agree what we're going to see happening over the coming weeks and months, and there's lots of discussions around bailouts and everything, that we need to get into a sort of very proactive mode and not just being reactive to all these events, obviously, which we're traditionally having to do, particularly as trade unionists. So we are discussing, for those in the UK and in London, we are setting up a London meeting at the moment, hopefully towards the end of May, early part of June. So if you're interested in being involved in that, then do get in contact with us. Do set up meetings around the country, and obviously in your workplace, and drawing on the ideas obviously that have been brought up in the sessions tonight. If you do want to join up and keep in touch with the Lucas plan generally. We do have a discussion group and also a kind of announcements group. So if you want to contact info@breakingtheframe.com, I think it is. Sorry, info@breakingtheframe.org.uk, then we can add you to the mailing list. Hillary's showing the book, which is on sale through Spokesman. Do read it. It is very good and worth a read. Well, several reads. It's clearly one of those which you can't just read once. And do visit the Green Jobs Oshawa website. Obviously all the stuff that Rebecca has spoken about is on there. The feasibility study, which again, I really like the idea of the triple bottom line in that, and I think that that's a really insightful document as well, because I think obviously what we struggle is, as you know, some things Phil's talked about in terms of the nuts and bolts of doing things, and I think that really gives a kind of insight for how we can actually start developing some of these plans and having these conversations. And I guess just the sort of final plug, as I said at the beginning, and sorry to say it again, talk about the evil of money, but this has cost us obviously to host this event, even though it's online. So if you do have a few spare pounds, and I know that's probably quite a difficult request in the current situation, then there is a donate button on the Lucas plan website to donate there. So thank you all again. Thank you for all the attendees. It's been a fantastic sign on, so turn out to this meeting, and really appreciate all the comments and questions, and hopefully we will continue discussing these, because another way is possible. What seemed impossible just a few weeks ago, we can see certainly is possible, but we need to keep it there and we need to fight for it. So thanks again everybody, and solidarity.